Hi, good afternoon, guys. And today we're going to be discussing a very misleading and controversial topic in aspects of fitness or even performance, and that is flexibility and mobility training. Now, to give you guys an idea concerning about flexibility, it's used in a number of different aspects, and you'll hear many people discuss what the benefits of flexibility is. However, it is very misleading in a lot of ways because uh, there, if you look at the actual literature, there is no real support saying that flexibility actually has a benefit for many different aspects. For instance, people use flexibility and mobility training for injury prevention and performance, and those are probably the most two aspects in which flexibility training is applied. Now, where the issue comes in is the context of where that flexibility training is implemented. And what I mean by that is, yes, flexibility training is important for some individuals if you happen to be someone who shows inflexibility. However, if you're on the performance aspect where you need the elastic ability of your ligaments and muscle tissue, it might not be the best benefit. And in fact, it gets very much misapplied because you have physical therapists, as well as strength and conditioning coaches, as well as yoga teachers, all blending certain aspects of fitness together. And they sometimes mislead people because they don't take in the context of the individual or the sport. And we're going to look at some of the literature to kind of maybe sway you guys um, in regarding mobility and flexibility, even when you implement it for your athletes and your clients. First, let's just define it quickly. And flexibility is simply a measure of range of motion around a joint. And that's typically what it is. Now, you can also look at flexibility from a static and dynamic aspect, whereas static is synonymous with passive, meaning that there's no muscle tone going to the muscle tissue itself, or motor tone, I'm sorry, and it's just using some kind of passive force to stretch a muscle. Dynamic, on the other hand, is synonymous with active or reciprocal inhibition, where you're actively engaging one muscle to get the other opposite muscle to relax. As we know, that's called reciprocal inhibition. The difference between the two is one is no motor tone and the other has motor tone. Typically, you can get larger ranges of motion with a dynamic stretch. Let's just take a consideration with this figure, where oftentimes, um, I'm sorry, this is an example of where passive flexibility can be misapplied. For instance, if you look at the figure on the right, you see an individual go into a passive um, movement, whereas on the left, sometimes individuals think just because if I isolate a specific pattern or flexibility, it's going to transfer over into a movement pattern. And that's generally not always the case. And this figure pretty much outlines that. Now, I want to point out this particular book at the moment. This is Advances in Functional Training by a guy named Mike Boyle. And Mike Boyle happens to be a very phenomenal strength coach. He's popularized a lot. He actually runs a website called strengthcoach.com. Well, the problem with Mike Boyle is that he has collaborated with a lot of other people in the industry that don't necessarily do what they do. Remember, we discussed the differences between performance and health. And even though they overlap at points, they are two separate entities. Anyways, what I'm trying to get at is he started to take aspects from different worlds and started to apply them with performance. And that's great in theory, but it doesn't necessarily pan out the way we want in terms of performance. And let's just take a look at the figure on the right. Whereas this is a typical training program flow from day to day. And if you notice from here, They usually, all his athletes come in, they start with some kind of tissue release, then they go into some kind of static stretching, and then they go into some kind of activation, which is another form of dynamic stretching. Then their warm up, and then plyometrics, which you can kind of think of as uh, ballistic stretching. And here's just kind of the sequence before the training actually begins. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because a lot of practitioners, perhaps even the ones that you know of now, who, if you play any athletics, have adopted this training flow program. And we're going to find out what this does in terms of the performance realm, and does it actually decrease the incidence of injury. Before we actually get into the literature, let's just briefly describe each one of these types of stretch. Like we said before, passive stretch or static stretch is synonymous with a passive force during a stretch, and it's typically held at an end range by the force of gravity. Dynamic stretching is usually an active force, and that's reciprocal inhibition, contracting your agonist to get relaxation of the antagonist, and that is also held at end ranges. And then you have ballistic stretching, which is similar to like plyometrics or whatnot, where you're actually using some kind of bouncing type movement to get further ranges of motion. So let's first look at injury prevention. Does flexibility training actually decrease the rate of injury? Well, I will tell you this because, I've done a lot of research throughout grad school and whatnot. Now, one thing when it comes to flexibility training is we can never truly causally interpret if flexibility training actually lowers or increases the rate of injury. Reason being is because your outcome variable would have to be injury, meaning that you'd have to set up an experimental design and you'd have to actually record the incidences of actual injury. Well, that is ideally never going to happen because you would never get it passed by the IRB, and it'd be extremely difficult to get subjects to sign up for a study where they get injured. There is no benefit to that. But when we actually do look at epidemiological research regarding flexibility, it resembles this upside down parabola. And if you notice here on the y-axis, we have injury rate, and then on the x-axis, you have flexibility. It seems that the less flexible you are, as indicated by the x-axis, the less flexible you are, your injury rate goes up. But if you somewhat get into a normal range, your injury rate goes down. But if you are hyper flexible, your injury rate also goes up. And that's what we know through epidemiological research. One particular paper to showcase that was this paper titled Epidemiology of Injuries Associated with Physical Training Among Young Men in the Army. And essentially what they did is they tracked these individuals, these 300 men, over the course of their recruit training. And what they noted about them before coming into recruit training, they wanted to know previous physical activity. They also did a sit and reach flexibility test, and they looked at running economy. Now, their outcome variable, one thing that they were tracking over the course of the recruit training was the incidence of injury. And here is what they found regarding the relative risk or the risk percentage. Whenever they did the sit and reach test, individuals who had a negative 23 to negative 4 centimeters had roughly almost a 50% chance of being injured. This is where the U shape or the upside down parabola comes in. So they're very inflexible. Going on the next thing, if you're negative 4 to 1 centimeters, which is still inflexible but not as much, your relative risk goes down, but it's still relatively high. Now, if you're in the normal range, you have a much lower risk, roughly about 20%. However, you start taking it beyond that normal range, and as you can tell by the graph, your incidence of injury starts to go up. And again, here we see that when they actually put all those individuals into quartiles from the low to high. And on the right, we actually look at the relative risk. It's kind of like an effect size. And notice that on the two extremes, the relative risk for flexibility is much higher. Now that poses the question: if you have people who showcase normal flexibility, do they need to add more flexibility? Well, in this particular paper, that might not be the best thing to do, because individuals tend to be more suspect to injury the more flexible they are, as well as inflexible. Now, that was only one paper, and that is an epidemiological cohort study. If you guys can recall, in regards to the quality of that data, those types of research articles are not necessarily the highest. The highest type of research are systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Again, it's very hard to causally interpret whether flexibility training has an effect on injury incidence because your outcome variable is injury. But let's look at what this systematic review and what these authors said about flexibility. So on the left, you're seeing all of the studies collectively in our field regarding flexibility training on the outcome of injury. And what they did is they only had 3 random control trials, meaning where they actually implemented some kind of flexibility training to actually measure to see if anybody would get injured. Most of them were just epidemiologically looking retrospectively to see if people got injured. And again, that is lower quality research. Again, here are all those studies. And notice from what the authors write here, they state there's no association with injury, no protective effect, or no increased injury rates with aspects of implementing stretching prior to any kind of training. In addition, when they actually looked at the 3 studies that were random control trials, and I'll just read it off to you guys, from the authors themselves, the 3 random control trials in the study that address stretching and injuries failed to demonstrate a protective effect of supervised stretching. So just think back to how it's done in practice. Typically, I'm assuming many of you guys, especially if you're in athletics or if you are athletic trainers, you typically do some kind of static stretching or stretching protocol prior to the training bout or practice. Now, is that necessarily the best approach? Well, it says there's no demonstration of whether it's going to provide a protective effect or not. So, in some cases, you may or may not need to do that. However, if somebody is already flexible, then it's probably not the best approach. Usually, again, it always has to come down to the context of the individual as well as the sport itself. Now let's look at this from a performance standpoint. We've already looked at it from the injury standpoint, and I can pretty much confidently tell you all that the research regarding flexibility training or mobility training on injury rate is equivocal, meaning that it's right now there's no real clear answer. It's still up in the air whether that's the case. I will say, based off some of those data, flexibility training is important for those who are very inflexible, probably not going to be the best for somebody who's hyper flexible, and probably not going to be best for individuals who are within the normal ranges, right? So now let's carry that into performance. Now I want to pose this question to you guys. Is the most flexible athlete the most successful? And that's probably not always the case, but it does have some relevance to the context of the individual. And I want to put some biomechanics aspect into this. Consider a baseball player, for instance. And baseball players, or let's say more specifically a pitcher. Pitchers ideally want to throw a very fast fastball. And if you notice by that red line of the arc, that's basically the time of when the windup or force is being applied to the baseball upon release. Okay? Now, it's very important for a baseball player to have good thoracic mobility as well as external rotation of the arm. And the reason why that is because of this equation, right? We're going to put some physics into this. What you see is L equals M times V. What this states right here is momentum. Momentum is signified by the letter L. And momentum mathematically is equal to the mass times velocity. So let's just put the mass of that baseball. That baseball weighs 128 grams. Now, in order for him to increase the momentum, the mass is constant, so he's going to have to increase the velocity, right? Well, this is where flexibility training will come into play, because momentum is also equal to impulse. Those two are directly proportional to one another, meaning if one goes up, the other one will go up at the same rate, right? That's what they mean by directly proportional. So impulse, the mathematical equation for impulse is force times time, or the amount of time or the amount of force that's being applied over that time frame. So if I can apply the same force but for a longer time, I can increase impulse. Well, because those two things equal one another, if I increase the time by increasing the mobility of the thoracic extension and thoracic rotation, as well as the external rotation of his arm, I can increase the amount of time in which force is applied to that baseball, and therefore increase velocity. So this is a perfect example of where the context of flexibility has to be met with the sport itself and the individual. However, there is a caveat to that, because force in itself is not just from the tissue or the muscle tissue. You also have passive aspects that are contributing to force, such as the ligaments, the tendons, and the connective tissue. And those actually provide a good amount of overall tension or force to be applied to certain things. Again, a lot of performance usually goes in with creating a lot more force, and that's how athletes get better. Now, if I were to stretch those tissues, that actually will mess with some of the elasticity of those tissues that we just discussed. And the elasticity is the ability to return to original resting length. Now, let's just take an example of this. Here you're seeing what we know as a sarcomere. And the sarcomere is the smallest unit of contraction within the muscle. And that's where the myosin and the actin filaments contract over one another, and they slide inward, pulling the Z disc closer together, and that's where you get muscle contraction. Now, the thought process is those cross bridges actually pull in together. But let's say, for instance, you stretch the muscle, and now there's less cross bridges to actually bind to those actin filaments. And therefore, a lot of times, the thought is you're going to lose force production because there's less cross bridges able to pull those actin filaments together. Now let's look at the actual research concerning stretching or flexibility on performance. Let's first consider the cardiovascular aspects. And this is a study by Gilbert Geim, and it's titled the influence of flexibility on the economy of walking and jogging. This thing's not working. So in this study, they took 100 individuals and they did a treadmill test at 6 different speeds, anywhere from 53 meters a minute to 187 meters per minute. And what they did is they checked running economy, or that's just another measurement of VO2 max. Not necessarily going to their VO2 max, but they're looking at how much oxygen they're taking in for each one of these different speeds. The more oxygen that you would take in would indicate that you're using more energy for that given workload. And here are the number of flexibility tests that they performed on all these 100 individuals. Now, they did this, they didn't implement this test. I'm sorry, they didn't implement these types of stretch. They just tested these individuals to see how flexible they were, and they categorized them into normal, tight, or loose. And now let's just look at what those things happen. Here we have 3 different categories at multiple different speeds, right? And notice that if you were categorized in the loose category, your demand or your oxygen cost was the highest. However, if you were normal, yours got lower. But even more importantly, if you were, so to speak, tight or being less flexible, your energy costs were much less. Now just think about that. I'm going to show you guys a couple other figures. And that was pretty much unanimous across the board for all these different measurements. And the reason being is that this is from the authors themselves. Individuals having tightness in the trunk and the lower extremity around the longitudinal axis were especially efficient at every speed. Now remember that figure I showed you guys concerning passive and active force. The tighter somebody is, the less active force that they need to apply from their musculature to propel them along a given axis or whatnot. So the tighter you are, actually from a exercise or economical standpoint from running economy, is actually better for endurance events. Now let's take another look at this other paper, right? And this is titled by the effects of static stretching on a 1-mile uphill run performance. And this is actually done by a colleague of mine at the University of Tampa. His name is Dr. Ryan Lowry, and we did this together back in 2014. Well, we actually took 10 trained distance runners, and we had one protocol of these 10 trained distance runners. We had them come to the laboratory where they did a 1-mile performance test, non-stretching. Now, we had those same individuals come back, so they served as their own control group. This is what we know as a within-group study design. And then we had them stretch prior to actually doing the test itself. And this is the results that we found. Notice that when individuals stretched prior to their runtime actually went up, meaning it took them longer to complete the actual test itself. Whereas when they did the stretching protocol, they were much faster. Now, the difference here on average was only about 15 seconds. Keep in mind, this is a 1-mile run. In a race though, especially if you're a runner who runs like the 800-meter or what have you, 15 seconds is a very, very long time. And you also notice with this asterisk here that result was statistically significant, meaning that there's a 95% chance that this event did not occur by chance alone, meaning that stretching was a cause for that um, difference in time. Here we also measured muscle activation and ground contact time. And notice that muscle activation is actually higher in the stretching group, indicating that they are using less passive force and they're having to use more muscle to uh, have better to run. And as you can tell, because they're having to use that, their ground contact time also goes up as well, because they have a less elasticity in their ligaments and tendons. Now, this isn't always the case, right? Stretching is not necessarily always bad. And here's a paper by Nelson Earl in 2001 to kind of show that. In this particular case, they did a non-stretching and a stretching group protocol. In this case, though, they had two different groups. They had one group stretch and the other group not stretch. Now, the thing is, in this protocol, it was actually 10 weeks in duration. The stretching protocol took 3 days per week. They did a total of 15 stretches, and they were performed after or on separate days of the running themselves. Whereas the other group did no stretching. They just did their running protocol. Now let's actually look at what happened, right? Pre and post. Here we're looking at flexibility itself as indicated by a sit and reach. Notice that the control group, there was no change in the flexibility. It pretty much stayed the same. Whereas the group that did do stretching, they did increase their sit and reach test by roughly maybe 5 centimeters at most, maybe a little less, right? So they did increase their flexibility. So what happened to their performance? Well, actually nothing. Nothing happened to performance. So this goes on to show that if you are implementing flexibility training, it's ideal to not do it beforehand. Ideally, you want to do it after or on separate days. And you notice that the O2 cost was pretty much the same across the board. And as I just said, stretching may not be detrimental to performance if performed after or on separate days from training or competition. So now let's look at strength and power. Okay, we just discussed the aspects of what it does to endurance. And it seems that stretching before a training bout or before competition may increase your running time, which is actually bad. So now let's switch gears, strength and power. And here we have a very classic article by Barroso et al. In 2012. And this title Maximal Strength, Number of Repetitions, and Total Volume are differently affected by static, ballistic, and proprio neuromuscular facilitation stretching. Now, static, as we know, is just a passive force. It's being held by, there's no muscle activation. Ballistic is kind of what you might consider like a bouncing. It can also be somewhat dynamic. Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, that is reciprocal inhibition, where you're actually holding stretches by activating the agonist by simultaneously inactivating or inhibiting the antagonist. Now let's see what it had on performance. So they had 12 strength trained athletes, and they did a within group study design, meaning these 12 strength trained athletes did each protocol. So they served as their own control. In one case they did static, in one case they did PNF, and then in another case they did ballistic. And what they measured was the total volume, the maximal number of reps, and their 1 RM strength. And let's just look closely at what happens to each one of these. Here we're looking at the difference in volume, right? Notice that whenever they did PNF, it increased their range of motion the greatest. So they get the greatest range of motion. Static stretching gets the second most. Ballistic stretching gets the third most. But let's look at what happened to their difference in training volume, which we know is a very, very key factor for or an acute training variable for adaptation of the musculature. Notice that when those individuals stretched prior, their training volume fell down by roughly almost 1,700 kilograms. And it pretty much is unanimous across the board where they actually lose a lot of training volume. In my opinion, that is probably grounds enough to say that stretching prior to training is very, very it's just not a great thing to do for performance or training. Now let's look at the number of repetitions, which is a function of overall training volume. And if you notice from when they actually tested as controls, their number of repetition goes down across the board, and they're dropping anywhere from say 8 reps to roughly 7 reps from all 3 training conditions. And then lastly, we have differences in 1 RM strength. And again, across the board, strength falls down on all stretching conditions. And in fact, it's mostly detrimental when you did PNF. So again, it may not be beneficial to stretch prior to competition or training. Now let's look at another article titled "The Influence of Strength, Flexibility, and Simultaneously Training on Flexibility and Strength Gains." Now this was a 16-week training program, and they used 80 sedentary women. On one group they had strength training alone, another group was just flexibility training, and another group was strength training and flexibility training. And lastly, you had a control group that did nothing at all. And here we see differences in flexibility as indicated by a sit and reach. Notice that even strength training alone increased flexibility by roughly 6 centimeters. And that was shown to be statistically significant from the control group. Now, it wasn't as good as flexibility or the flexibility and strength training together. But notice this, that strength training and flexibility put in together actually increased flexibility more so than flexibility alone. In my opinion, strength training, if trained in the full range of motion, can actually help in increasing range of motion or in flexibility without hindering performance results. But let's just look at what happened in this case. Here we're looking at the 10 rep max bench press after 16 weeks. The strength training group went up 10 kilograms, whereas the strength training group plus flexibility only went up roughly 6. The flexibility alone got no increase, whereas the control group obviously would get no increase as well. So it seems that flexibility training done prior to the strength training by itself could actually impede an individual's performance gains. Same thing was found in the 10 RM leg press. Strength training alone went up roughly 50 kilograms. Strength and flexibility, 40. Flexibility alone went up 5. And the control went up 0. Now let's look at one more article, and this is titled "Acute Effects of a Warm-Up Including Active, Passive, and Dynamic Stretching on Vertical Jump Performance." Now this particular article has a little bit mixed results, but we'll go ahead and look at it anyways. This article had, or this particular paper had 16 youth tennis players, and what they did is they did a dynamic warm-up followed with either no stretching, passive stretching, active stretching, or PNF, and then they just did dynamic stretching. And what they wanted to test is that if or any of these types of protocols or stretching protocols would affect counter movement jump or stagger jump. Now here you're looking at counter movement jump from all the way to left is no stretching or the control to passive, then you have active, and then or PNF, and then you have dynamic. Now in this particular case, this study showed conflicting results from what we saw in the past. The PNF actually increased their jump performance over the control group. Now I will say this, there's a caveat to this study, whereas these individuals, they did these protocols on 4 separate days. Again, all these tennis athletes, they served as their own control, and there was no time in between in which these tennis players were able to rest. So what you're seeing here could just be a result of normal variation, right? And also, these jump heights, even though they are statistically different, it's only a difference of 1 centimeter. Now, on the same notion, however, if you look at the no stretching group, the passive, the active, and the dynamic, same thing happens, or no, something completely different happens. The most performance benefit was found on the control group, whereas the active and the passive seemed to decline, and the dynamic actually went up. Another reason why this could happen is because the players by which protocol they did on each different day was done by random. Again, it was 4 consecutive days, and then afterwards they did their tennis training. So what you could see is just normal fluctuations and just fatigue alone. Ideally, this protocol should have been done with a washout period, where they, on one day, they would do 1 day, rest for 3 days, do the same thing, and then continue it with the next. So this brings me back to this particular book. The reason why I bring this book up because it's a very popular book among strength coaches, personal trainers, and athletes. And again, taken in together with what I just showed you from the research, notice what they do prior to their actual training itself, the training bouts itself that's implemented right here. They do all these types of different stretching protocols prior to the movement itself. Now, would that actually have a benefit to performance? Well, I'll just read something from this Barrasso article that we once saw earlier. The results from this study suggest that to avoid a decrease in both number of repetitions and total volume, stretching exercises should not be performed before a resistance training session. And in a lot of cases, such as in this case, they typically do this type of stretching bouts or protocols before the training itself. And again, the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of strength coaches have adopted this style of training for their athletes or even team sports. So to summarize, flexibility training should be incorporated with the context of the sport and the athlete's limitations. Now, it is unclear whether flexibility training can decrease the incidence of injury. However, careful considerations should be used if an individual is hypermobile or inflexible. Flexibility can have detrimental effects on performance, such as running economy, strength, and power. Ideally, flexibility and mobility work should be performed after a training session. And lastly, prior to competition, if you are going to stretch your athletes, PNF and static stretching should be avoided. Dynamic stretching is probably the best practice. Thank you.